After a nearly month-long trial, jurors in the Avery case began their deliberations. Soon they reached a verdict. Ephraim K. Avery was not guilty of the murder of Sarah Maria Cornell. Following his acquittal, Avery was released from custody. The question of his legal guilt was settled. A Methodist conference that met in Boston just weeks after his trial held its own investigation to address the questions of his spiritual and religious guilt. A special committee composed of Methodist leadership looked into whether Ephraim Avery was guilty of seducing and having criminal intimacy with Maria Cornell, and whether he was implicated in her death. The committee found that there was no evidence to suggest that criminal intimacy had occurred between Avery and Cornell, save for Cornell's word, which the committee deemed untrustworthy. Cornell, they said, was of bad character, suffering from moral depravity and mental derangement. The committee dismissed her allegations against Avery as a mere act of revenge on him for having expelled her from church membership. In the absence of believable evidence that Avery had engaged in sex with Cornell, the committee found that no motive for him to have committed the murder existed. They acquitted him on both charges and quickly returned him to the ministry. And yet the results of the Methodist investigation did little to calm public furor over Cornell's death. If anything, Avery's acquittal only intensified a widespread public anger and sense of injustice. A day after the issuance of the Methodist Committee report acquitting him of all wrongdoing, Reverend Avery was thronged by a mob of 500 hostile Bostonians as he walked through the city. Although he was rescued before the mob could harm him, several elaborate and hostile public displays followed this incident. In Providence, Rhode Island residents found an empty coffin floating down the river. On its top was printed the name Ephraim K. Avery. In Fall River, citizens hung an effigy of Avery near Durfee's stackyard, repeatedly shot it, and then burned it in the town square. Similar acts of symbolic violence towards Reverend Avery took place all throughout New England. Avery's case continued to be a sensation in the worlds of print and entertainment in the months after it resolved. In Providence, Rhode Island, a writer calling himself only Aristides published and sold a series of 18 essays titled Strictures, outlining the evidence against Avery and decrying the Methodist Church's handling of his case. Catherine Williams, a New England writer, published a book on Fall River's history that was largely about Cornell's life and murder. In Newport, Rhode Island, a playwright wrote and staged a theatrical show called Factory Girl, or The Fall River Tragedy, which ran for 2 weeks in front of packed audiences. Another theater in New York City put on its own show about Cornell's death, which also proved tremendously popular with audiences. Both productions cast Maria Cornell as a noble but vulnerable factory girl, trying to support herself and her family, and Ephraim Avery as a vile and wicked seducer whose deadly wiles she was too naive to resist. For months after the plays closed, patrons of Broadway theaters continued to request that songs decrying Avery as guilty and calling for his execution be performed in revues. The songs were so popular that their lyrics were printed and sold to the public. So too were cartoons depicting Avery as a wretched killer. Public engagement with questions of Avery's guilt was so intense that murder at times begot murder. Shortly after Avery's trial, 2 business partners in upstate New York were reading newspaper coverage of his acquittal when they began arguing with one another about his guilt. One of the men decried the Methodist Church for helping Avery to escape justice. The other, himself a devout Methodist, defended the church. Their argument grew so passionate that it devolved into a brawl. One of the men stabbed the other to death. Why did Americans in the 1830s continue to respond so strongly to the Tiverton tragedy even after the trial was over? What was it about Maria Cornell's life and death and Avery's acquittal that made this case impress upon them so strongly that they continued to write, talk, and even kill about it for years to come? And furthermore, what can that tell us about this period in U.S. history?